Good day. No event in the Russian political calendar, to my mind, exposes the divergence between the topics which interest the Western commentariat and the topics which interest ordinary Russians more starkly than the speech or annual address that Putin gives to the Russian parliament, or the two houses of the Russian parliament, the Federal Assembly. Russians, in my experience, tend to be overwhelmingly focused on what Putin has to say about domestic policy, about the economy, about the social sphere, about healthcare, about such things. Westerners, or at least the Western commentariat, by contrast, is overwhelmingly focused on the foreign policy, defense, and security aspects of the speech, and they tend to ignore completely, or almost completely, what he has to say about domestic policy. It has to be said that from time to time, one does encounter exceptions. In 2018, Putin made a speech to the Russian parliament in which he unveiled a whole new series of exotic new weapons and technologies which Russia was developing in order to counter the US buildup and, in particular, the US deployment of anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Europe. That attracted a lot of attention in Russia. And last year, Putin also outlined a series of changes to Russia's constitution, which was subsequently confirmed in a national referendum, and which many see, and which quite possibly are intended to be a vehicle for enabling him to stand for two further terms after his present term runs out in 2024. That domestic issue attracted a lot of attention in the West. But generally, the paradigm that Russians are focused on the internal aspects of the speech and Westerners on the external aspects, that usually holds. And it certainly holds in respect of the speech that Putin gave on the 21st of April. Now, this speech was overwhelmingly focused on domestic issues, which is why there's been remarkably little commentary about it in the West. And in fact, Putin, in his opening words, said as much. He said, "Today's presidential address to the Federal Assembly will be dedicated mostly to internal issues. These include, naturally, healthcare, social policy, and the economy. Of course, I will say a few words about external affairs and literally a few words about security issues." It is, in fact, those last points about external affairs and security issues which have attracted the greater attention in the West, and which I will actually come to in a moment. But most of the speech, exactly as Putin said, around 4/5 of it, was devoted to domestic internal questions. I'm going to come to those in a moment, but first I do want to say a few things about the external, the comments that Putin made about external affairs and security issues. Now, he did make a few points about the Russian military buildup, and he spoke about the continued deployment and expansion of Russia's security and defense forces. He said that 78% of Russian armaments are now either modern, in other words, post-Soviet, or modernized. He said that 88% of Russia's strategic triad, its nuclear forces, are entirely modernized. In other words, they post-date the Soviet Union. And he said that new weapons of various types, some of which he discussed in that speech that he gave in 2018, are either already deployed or on the brink of being deployed. So next year, the Russians will be deploying their heavy Sarmat ICBM capable of hitting the United States from Russia, and indeed passing via the South Pole in order to do it. He also mentioned that the Kinjal hypersonic anti-ship missile is now in ever greater deployment and is in active service. He hinted that the Kinjal might soon also be deployed on naval ships, and that's a very interesting and tantalizing fact, which will concern the Americans a great deal, given that the Kinjal is seen as a carrier killer. That another anti-ship missile, another hypersonic anti-ship missile, the Zircon, will soon be in service also, and that what are perhaps the most tantalizing of Russia's new weapons, the Poseidon nuclear-powered torpedo and the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile, both of which can be launched against the United States from Russia. These will be deployed imminently. Perhaps he also alluded to perhaps the most mysterious system of all, the Peresvet laser system, which nobody seems to have any explanation of what it is actually for. Anyway, so he talked about that, and he also talked about the coup in Belarus, which my colleague Alex Christoforou and I discussed recently in a program which we did for the Duran. I'm going to say more about that in another video. He also dropped some very heavy hints about the spat that Russia is currently in with the Czech Republic, where the Czechs and the Russians are busy expelling each other's diplomats. He made some barbed comments about this, though he was careful not to mention the Czech Republic by name. He, however, conspicuously said nothing about the strategic relationship with the United States. He said very little indeed about relations with the West in general. And at a time when the Russians have built up enormous military forces along Ukraine's border, and where in response to a build-up by Ukraine of its forces along the contact line, his remarks about Ukraine were limited to one single sentence, in which significantly and importantly, he again referred to the events of 2014, which overthrew President Yanukovych, the elected president of Ukraine, and created the new political environment in which Ukraine currently operates. He once again referred to those events as a coup, thereby casting doubt on the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government. But other than that, he did actually say very, very little indeed about foreign affairs. And that actually is interesting, given how tense the international environment is. And I would say it's not only interesting, it is also undoubtedly deliberate, and there is unquestionably a reason for it. And I don't think it is difficult to gauge what that reason is. Firstly, it's important to say that sometimes silence can tell you as much as 1,000 words. And I think the fact that Putin and his senior officials decided to leave out of Putin's annual address to the Russian parliament much discussion of foreign policy tells one actually a very great deal about the current international situation. Firstly, as we've discussed, it's very tense. The Russians and the Americans and the Russians and the West are locked into a tense standoff. There's all those military forces in and around Ukraine, which I talked about. There's the US Navy coming and going from the Black Sea. There's the British inserting themselves into the Black Sea, even where angels, or to be more precise, the United States, in its mighty navy, fear to tread. There's all sorts of things going on along in this relationship between Russia and the West, which Putin was careful not to talk about. And I think that there is a straightforward reason why. Now, if we go back to the events of last week, you will all recall that they began, or at least the US-Russia aspect of the questions began with a telephone call from President Biden of the United States to Putin, in which Biden invited Putin to a summit meeting and spoke about the need for Russia and the United States to agree clear lines and to sort out a proper, stable, predictable relationship. That telephone conversation was then undermined by an extraordinary decision the following day to impose sanctions on Russia. Now, I've discussed both that telephone call and those sanctions in several videos. I pointed out that the sanctions actually were considerably less significant than the initial appearances suggested, and that they are in fact hollow. And in fact, their effect on Russian financial markets have been marginal. The Russian financial markets, are now stronger than they were before those sanctions were imposed. Biden then, on the following day, after the sanctions were imposed, gave what appeared to be a hurried news conference in which he went out of his way to say that his real intentions were those set out in his conversation to Putin, and that he does want to put relations between the United States and Russia on an even keel and find a stable way forward. And subsequent to that telephone conversation between Putin and Biden, and subsequent to that press conference by Biden, there's been at least one telephone conversation that we know of, though there have been apparently previously two others, though these may have been earlier in the year, between Biden's and Putin's two top foreign policy advisors, Jake Sullivan and Nikolai Patrushev. And there does seem to be some sort of dialogue or discussion between the Americans and the Russians, or at least between some parts of the US administration and the Russians, currently underway. And it seems that the US is indeed, or at least a part of the administration, is extremely keen on achieving a summit meeting and setting up something which the Russians have referenced as a bilateral mechanism in order to agree what the respective red lines of the two countries are with respect to their relations between each other. We don't know what this is all about. We don't know the detail, but some kind of discussions are underway. Now, this speech that Putin gave to the Russian parliament, I think, omitted detailed discussion about US-Russian relations precisely because Putin and the Russians do not want anything to be said which might jeopardize those discussions between the Americans and the Russians that are going on in private and which are currently underway. The one thing that did stand out is that Putin, for the first time that I know about in any speech, made it very clear that in connection with Russia's relations with the United States, Russia is going to impose or insist on its red lines, and that it's going to insist that the United States adhere to those red lines. These include non-interference by the United States in Russian internal affairs, and of course there is going to be some degree of external dimension to this also. Thus, any idea of Georgia or Ukraine joining NATO or the European Union would be effectively ruled out. I think that it's absolutely clear that this is what Putin has in mind, and this is what his words about red lines, which were in the speech, are intended to mean. Now, no doubt, all sorts of other things are under discussion also. I mean, the JCPOA with Iran and the United States' very fraught relationship with Iran, Libya, Syria, the Open Skies Treaty, and all those things. But it's important to understand that as far as the Russians are concerned, it is those two issues, interference in their internal affairs and their red lines about what they see as their near abroad, countries that formed part of the former Soviet Union, and their determination that those countries will not be brought into NATO, that explains that is, for the Russians, the central and key issue. And I think that that is where the Russians are going to place their primary emphasis in the talks, and there will not be a summit unless and until they get from the Americans some admission or concession that in future those red lines are going to be adhered to. Well, we shall see. The entire tone of Putin's speech was extremely skeptical. He is clearly not willing to assume anything, and he is far from sure that the United States will in fact act on the kind of steps that it is taking to try to improve relations, or at least to put relations between the United States and Russia on an even keel. So we will see whether this dialogue really does amount to anything. But in any event, that seems to be what the Russians are saying. They set out their stall, if you like, and it is now for the Americans to move towards them. Now, having said all of that, it's important again to return to the fact that most of the speech was about internal economic and social and healthcare policy. And here I'm going to just say a very few things. Firstly, it's important to stress that though these matters that Putin talks about on healthcare, on social policy, on economics, are not of great interest to most people in the West, they are of huge interest to ordinary Russians. Russians with families are interested in the fact that it is now possible for Russian children to receive hot meals paid by the government when they are at school. It is also of very great interest to many young Russians that there's going to be an extension, an increase in the number of university places paid for by the government. It's also of great interest to many Russians that there is a major infrastructure program being planned with new roads and transport links being constructed and all sorts of things like that. And of course, it is of huge interest to the Russians, especially during the period of the pandemic, that the Russian government is making improvements in healthcare a priority issue, and that there will be heavy funding directed towards updating and upgrading Russia's health system. Last but not least, scientists are going to be very relieved that they've not been forgotten or overlooked, and that Russia is going to bump up further its spending on basic and fundamental science, particularly in civilian areas detached from military affairs. So, these are issues which are important to Russians. Now, these parts of the speech this year come in an important context, which I think has rarely been explained to people in the West. Briefly, for around 7 or 8 years before last year, the Russians, or at least the Russian government, had been focused on doing certain things with their economy. Firstly, their overriding priority was to bring down inflation, which in Russia has historically been very high. Until the early 2010s, Russia in every year since the fall of the Soviet Union registered double-digit inflation. It became a major social issue, and for the Russian government, it became an economic priority to bring inflation down into low single figures in order to enhance the productivity of the economy and to encourage investment and that achieve that prized goal of macroeconomic stability. That meant very high interest rates, a very tight monetary policy, and a certain policy of austerity, with the government also pursuing extremely careful budgeting policies. Well, by the beginning of last year, all this hard work appeared to have borne fruit, and inflation fell, indeed, finally, to the low single figures and seemed likely to stay there. The other thing the Russians were keen on doing was in putting away funding. And here it's important to say that for all sorts of reasons, the Russian government prefers not to borrow, but to put away savings that it accumulates principally from oil revenues, to use those savings, which have now reached very large dimensions, to fund a large-scale infrastructure program. Infrastructure obviously includes road, rail, and air links, but it also includes education and healthcare. And these have been outlined in a series of plans that Putin actually unveiled some time ago. There was going to be a very large $1 trillion investment program to upgrade Russia's infrastructure, which was expected to remove bottlenecks in the economy and which would in and of itself significantly enhance economic growth. 2020 was the year when that was all supposed to happen. And lastly, there has been a major effort by the Russians, again over the last 8 or so years, to build up and reorganize and strengthen their financial system. To that end, lots of small banks have been closed down or amalgamated with bigger banks. There's been a major effort to clean out the banking system of the various corrupt and insolvent banks with which it had become littered since the calamity period of the 1990s. There was efforts also to enhance payment vehicles within Russia, alternatives to SWIFT, the new Mir card, which is independent of Visa and MasterCard, and to do all sorts of things in order to get the Russian banking system into a position where it can start to actually fund significant investment in Russia's private economy. This is a major priority goal for the Russians, and as I again discussed in a recent video, the bonds that the Russian government from time to time floats on Russia's internal ruble markets are not so much intended to raise funding to cover the Russian government's operations or even its investment program, but more to provide Russian banks and financial institutions with a strong, reliable asset which they can then use as a hedge in order to increase their investment and lending to Russia's private economy. So, by the beginning of 2020, it seemed that all of this had been put in place. And as I well recall, at the beginning of 2020, the mood in Russia, at least amongst the government and the authorities, was highly optimistic, with expectations that Russia that year would grow, its economy would grow faster than was the case of most of the world. Well, then what happened was that the pandemic came. And with the pandemic, all the restrictions and problems which we are familiar with around the world. And all of these plans, which in 2020 had seemed to be about to be launched, had to be placed on hold. And there were real concerns at the start of the pandemic crisis that they would not merely have to be put on hold, but that they would have to be abandoned completely, because there was no certainty then about how long or severe the pandemic crisis in Russia would be, and whether in fact there would be the restrictions in place for most of the year, and whether the Russian government would have to fritter away its hard-won savings on supporting the economy instead of sorting them away, keeping them safe in order to finance its ambitious investment program. Well, 2020 has come and gone, and the Russians have been looking at the situation, and I think they are generally relieved by what they have found. What they have found is that the cost to Russia, economically speaking, of the pandemic has proved very limited. It's true that there was a contraction of the economy, as there was of nearly every economy apart from China's, but at 3% it was relatively small, and that contraction is expected to be erased entirely by around the middle of this year. Inflation did blip up, but not by much, and there are now expectations that it will come down quickly again. Most important of all, the Russians were able to limit the amount they had to spend on supporting their economy. There was no explosion of unemployment. There was no explosion of Russian government spending. There was no explosion of massive insolvencies across the economy. The economy has come through the pandemic crisis relatively intact. Debt levels, government debt has risen, but only a little. And the savings in the National Welfare Fund are still there. In fact, they've actually grown, as has the government's savings in foreign currency savings in the central bank, held by the central bank. The latter, by the way, is especially remarkable given the crash in oil prices which took place last year. Some of you may remember that there was a brief period when oil prices fell to precisely zero. So the Russians are now in a position, or so they believe, to start doing all those things that they had been planning to do a year ago. In other words, to crank up investment in their national infrastructure, to increase spending on healthcare and education, to increase science spending, to do all of those things that they had expected that they would be able to do last year, but which they had to be put off due to the pandemic. And that is what Putin's address was mainly about. There was one other important element. Russia has had two major demographic crises over the course of the 20th century. One was the Second World War, when Russian losses were on a simply enormous scale. And the second was during the 1990s, when astonishingly the losses were actually, in some respects, comparable. And that, unfortunately, has left a demographic echo effect where every 20 years or so, Russian population growth either slows or falls because of the few children that were born in the 1940s and 1990s and the poor health condition of many of the people who actually came through those two periods. And 2020 was expected to be the lowest point in that cycle. There was an expectation already, in fact, there was a certainty that the Russian population in 2020 would fall. And then, of course, the pandemic came, and that fall was worsened even further, largely because of the pandemic. So, an important aspect of Putin's speech, but one which, of course, the Russians have always been focused on anyway, was to do something which for the Russians is a major priority, which is to encourage the Russian population to have more children in order to make up for these demographic losses. And much of the speech, again, was devoted to this. I mentioned the hot dinners that have been provided to children in schools. There's also payoffs to people with children, payments to people with children, and there's all sorts of things being done to help families, including one-parent families with children. That is a very important part of this speech. So that, I think, is a fair summary of what Putin was talking about. Some talk about Russia's military might, the mailed fist, a careful a decision to say as little as possible about foreign policy so as not to disrupt the discussions and negotiations which are currently underway with the Americans, where Russia is showing at the moment something of a velvet glove. Of course, the mailed fist, the growth in military spending and in the development of all these weapons is there to remind the Americans of the fact that the velvet glove that's being extended to them is not the only hand that Russia has. A clear warning that Russia has red lines and will respond strongly if those red lines are crossed, which is, again, a message to the Americans, and far-sighted and carefully funded programs to take the economy forward in the future. Perhaps it's not the most spectacular of speeches. In some ways, I suppose one could almost call it low-key. But for Russians themselves, for the Russian population, undoubtedly very important and very interesting. And the indications are that they not only follow these speeches very carefully, but on this occasion they have responded to this speech very positively. And a clear-sighted view for Russia of the way forward. Well, thank you for joining me for this program on this channel. Please check out our other channels where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Our main channel, of course, is the Duran, but also check out his channel. You'll find links under this video. Please check us out on our various platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also, to the extent that you feel that you can, support us via PayPal, Subscribe, Star, and Patreon. Remember that we accept donations in all currencies, including the new independent ones. And also remember to check out our Discourse server and go to our shop where there's all these fabulous things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hats, our hoodies, and all the rest. And thank you for joining me for this program. And I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel also. And please don't forget to check your subscription.